All right, so we're going to get started. This is actually a very important talk today, and it's one second here. It's something that I was just in a meeting just now talking to some of our recruiters about this topic and just what an important issue it is. Because the big thing to understand is if you decide to relocate to another market, what you're doing essentially is making yourself able to get that many times more jobs. So if you have one market, there's that many jobs there. And if you go to another market, there's many more times jobs there sometimes. And I've changed countless careers and lives by enabling people to relocate. And it happens on a weekly basis. People that were formerly unemployed, sometimes for a long time, or underemployed, suddenly their whole careers and lives changed by the decision to relocate. So I'm going to talk about this today. I'm hopefully we'll tell a couple stories about relocation, and then this isn't that long of a presentation. And then after that, we'll take as many questions as people have. But I'm excited about this presentation today, and I hope that you guys really do listen to it because and consider things I'm talking about and how important it is. It's great to be able to live in one area of the country and move to another. And as an attorney, you really do have the ability to do that. There's certain states that are more difficult to relocate to than others, but most attorneys, once you have a law degree and you're admitted to the bar, even before then, you have the ability to move all sorts of places and all over the world, frankly, if you're in certain practice areas. And I've been doing this for a long time. And honestly, the majority of people, I think that I personally move. I don't know about all of our other recruiters, but I would say probably 50% are people that are relocating from one market to another. People that are relocating are typically much more attractive to law firms because the law firm isn't as worried about them maybe being a problem in their existing market or having issues. And many times when you relocate to another market, you're just going to be much, much better off in terms of your opportunity, the ability to find things that you might not be able to find in your existing market. And it's not always possible to relocate people. So I know that there's a lot of people that are international that would like to come and work in the United States. There's also attorneys in the US in many different practice areas like litigation where relocating would be extremely difficult. And, but for the most part, relocation for most attorneys is definitely an option. It can be difficult in some instances when you're relocating to an area where you might not have any ties. But if you're in the right practice area and there's not a lot of people doing it, then it can actually not be too difficult at all. I want to talk about different types of attorneys that may have the most success relocating and those who won't have success, and understanding kind of the markets where you're most likely to find the firms receptive. And in most markets, there's going to be opportunities for you, regardless of whether or not they have jobs. An attorney, frankly, you literally can move to almost anywhere you want in the country and get a job as an attorney if you know what to do. But there's a lot of factors that make it more difficult than others to get positions. I'm going to talk about those today. Other thing I would say in terms of placements, when I started in this business, which was in 1999 or 2000, over 60% of the placements that I made in 1 year were for people that were relocating to Silicon Valley from other areas of the United States. They could have been in Chicago or Detroit or Memphis, and there was such a need for not patent attorneys, but corporate attorneys at that time, that almost every placement we were making was just people relocating there. And there were just so many opportunities, and it was a very smart move for a lot of people to relocate to those markets, to that market at the time. And then in 2001, it changed, and there was a huge demand for people moving to California as litigators. But the results, there's a lot of reasons that this sort of thing happens, and it really depends on the type of attorney you are and the market you're relocating. Your success really is going to be dependent upon, I think, that the type of attorney that you are. And it really depends on your practice area. In terms of the practice areas, there's always certain practice areas that are really in demand at different points in time. So now's a time, for example, when corporate is in demand. Patent is becoming more in demand. Some litigators are almost always in demand, but now litigation is in demand in large markets. And it's generally much more difficult for all types of litigators to relocate. It's much easier for transactional attorneys to relocate. And then corporate is always a practice area where almost anybody who's a corporate attorney can fairly easily move to other markets if they have a good amount of experience doing it. But when the economy is good, you can sometimes even write your own ticket as a corporate attorney. And that's, I should add, regardless of where you're working. I've moved people from three-person law firms that didn't even go to top 100 law schools to major U.S. law firms in major markets from small markets when the economy was very good. And even in other areas of the world, if you do capital markets, for example, corporate attorneys can be marketable in different parts of the world. But when the economy slows down, it can also be difficult for corporate attorneys to get a job in certain markets, and then they become more marketable in smaller markets. And the big thing I think that you need to understand when you're trying to relocate is it really depends in a lot of cases on your practice area. So I'm going to talk about some of the major practice areas today, and then I'll also talk about some niche practice areas. But in terms of litigators, litigation is the hardest market to relocate with. And in order to relocate, most litigators need to have really good credentials. The problem with being a litigator and wanting to relocate is that there's just a lot of litigators. Most attorneys are litigators. Everyone learns how to be a litigator in law school, and there's a lot of general litigators. Now, in terms of specialist litigators, meaning people that do things like ERISA litigation or medical malpractice, or even different types of insurance litigation, and there's all sorts of specialist litigation. If you're a specialist, it's usually going to be much easier for you to relocate than if you're a generalist. And right now, it's very interesting. The market for litigators is not very good in New York City if you're like a general commercial litigator. So you could literally have gone to a top 5 law school, be at one of the top 50 best firms in New York, and have a very difficult time getting a position at a similar firm because there's so many litigators out there. But in terms of if you were like a medical malpractice litigator or something like that, or even insurance defense, the jobs won't pay as much, of course, but it's going to be much easier for you to get lots of jobs than if you weren't. The nice thing is that if you're a litigator, when the economy slows down, it's much easier to get a position. What I've noticed is when the market explodes and does very well, litigation tends to slow down. And then when the market slows down and when the market speeds up, litigation doesn't do as well. So I think that what happens, and I don't know if this is a pattern or not, but I think when the kind of the legal market slows down, people start suing and looking for money, and then corporate slows down, the law firms need money, and so I think that they get more aggressively involved in litigation. I don't know, and lawsuits drag on for years. So litigation is always marketable to some extent, but there's really just not. It's a much more difficult position to relocate. And so a lot of times, the other thing I think about litigators, especially if you're trying to work in a really good firm, that even if you're really good at it, a lot of times the law firms can't tell that. So they look at your traditional marketable skills. Like they'll look at if you did a clerkship and how you did in law school and so forth. And I think they look at that a lot more with litigators, especially when they're relocating, than they do with a lot of transactional attorneys, corporate attorneys, for example, where you're doing a different kind of transactional skill. Litigators, the best law firms are very concerned much more with your qualifications than they are corporate attorneys. And the skills to be a litigator, you need to be a writer, you need to have good negotiation skills, and some people have those and others don't. But there's just a real traditional kind of emphasis on those qualifications for litigators that are relocating. And most of the litigators that I've relocated from one state to another typically have pretty awesome qualifications there. And there's certain practice areas, like environmental litigation and stuff, where you may not need to have as good qualifications, but for the most part, that's how it works with litigation. And I think that's one of the reasons that these kind of qualifications about things about law review and clerkships and all that stuff, it seems to be much more emphasized than in a lot of other practice areas. And so if attorney has this, then they certainly can relocate from one large market to another, but it's more difficult. It's more difficult, I also think, because a lot of state courts have their own types of pleadings, and then they have, and the law isn't. Most attorneys don't do a lot of federal court litigation, so there's a lot of differences between litigation, and there's just a lot of them, like I said. The other thing is that if you're in a very niche practice area within litigation, it can be easier, but it's just very difficult for litigators to get hired out of state. It's California, for example, in New York, California is almost impossible many times for litigators to get hired laterally, especially without the bar from another state, because so many people fail the bar. I don't know what the pass rate is, but I think for people that are experienced attorneys, it's always under 50%. Sometimes I've seen it under 25%. So it's just a big risk for law firms to hire them. And then they have to bear all the relocation costs. And in the interim, there's always a lot of litigators locally that are looking for the same jobs that have good qualifications. So rather than take the risk, most times law firms, because there's so many people applying, it's all about supply and demand, and there's so many litigators. Rather than take the risk, a lot of times law firms just don't hire them. And there's just a lot of stuff. If someone's like a patent attorney, for example, that's all in federal court, and or it's from the patent bar, which is federal, so they can still work on things. And if someone is a corporate attorney, many times they're not signing pleadings, so they can still do a lot of work behind the scenes. And then the other problem with litigation is that once a litigator gets up to speed in a case, they become indispensable. And if they haven't passed the bar and so forth, that could be a big problem. And just there's a big kind of learning curve, and you just have to be aware of different things that are involved in moving. And this is a lot of information about litigators, I realize, and I don't really need to go too much more into it, but those are some of the reasons that it's very difficult to lateral as a litigator. The next thing is with corporate attorneys. Corporate attorneys have always been very easy to relocate. Every month, it seems, almost every week, I'm getting interviews all over the country multiple times a week. And every month for 20 years, I've placed one or more corporate attorneys personally each month. And each week we place corporate attorneys that are relocated to other markets. It's just a very easy practice area to relocate in. If you're in New York, you can relocate to Detroit. If you're in Detroit, you can relocate to New York. You can relocate from Miami to New York or Memphis. It's just, corporate attorneys really have a real ability to move around. And it's really like that for most transactional practice areas, by the way. So I'm going to talk a lot about corporate today, but similar for real estate, it's similar for patent, it's similar for anything that involves transactional related work. It's much easier to relocate because there's just not as many people that have that kind of training. And the more sophisticated your corporate training, the easier typically it is to relocate. But the thing is that is always important to understand is that everything is about the law of supply and demand. So like with litigators, there's always a lot of litigators out there. So there's a big supply, which means that for the most competitive firms, you have to have the best qualifications. For corporate attorneys, the supply and demand tends to really fluctuate. So what that means is during a really good economy, there's more demand for corporate attorneys than there are corporate attorneys. And so it always happens this way. And then in a bad economy, there's not a lot of new hiring for corporate attorneys. Corporate attorneys are laid off, and things just slow down and get very slow. And because of that, it becomes many corporate attorneys actually walk away from the practice of law, even ones that are in major law firms. It gets that bad. But it's always easier for corporate attorneys as well to get positions if they're coming from a major market. So I have people, for example, that I recently placed someone that was in London and moving back to, I think, Indiana, and they'd been a corporate attorney in London, never worked in the United States, probably got 8 or 9 interviews and 5 or 6 offers very quickly in Indiana, and with firms that didn't even have openings. And so if you're coming from a big market and you're moving back to a small market, you can almost always do very well as a corporate attorney. You can even move from a small market to a major market, but it's not as easy. Certainly if you were in Indiana and wanted to move to different types of markets, some Houston or something, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. But right now, at this particular point in time, the market is heated up so much for corporate attorneys that law firms all over the country are hiring people from small firms and people that don't have traditional pedigrees, very good firms that you would never expect to get in there. Sometimes over the past, we were talking about at a meeting the other day, some of the people that are getting hired now would never even get an interview 2 years ago, and the firms might even get mad at you for trying to represent the firm. And now they're actually getting hired and brought in enthusiastically. One of the things that makes corporate attorneys marketable, there's several things that make them marketable, but one of the things that makes them very marketable is that the skills are transferable. So learning how to be a corporate attorney and the skills that are in different types of things, whether it's capital markets or M&A, those skills tend to be transferable. So you can do the same. Once you learn how to do it in Chicago, you can go work in Texas and do the same sort of thing, and it's not very difficult. And so many people also learn very specialized skills as corporate attorneys. So for example, you may be responsible for just one aspect of a certain type of contract if you're a corporate attorney, and it's the biggest firms, and that will make you marketable to firms that do that, and you could be marketable in all sorts of markets you would never expect. I've seen attorneys that are only specialized in one aspect of a transaction and get interviews in markets you'd never expect, like Shanghai and Tokyo and so forth. It's pretty interesting when someone has very good skills like that, because you could be so specialized. You might be one of only a few attorneys in the world that has that experience. And sometimes if you get very specialized experience, it may hurt you because the work can be abolished and can go away. But for the most part, that doesn't happen very much. But the only thing, like I talked about earlier, that's bad is when the work slows down. And when the work does slow down, corporate typically is very bad, and it's very difficult, and people lose their job all over. So that's something to be concerned about. And it's bad. I've been through 2 or 3 recessions in corporate, and I've seen a lot of bad things happen. At the same time, one of the things I really like about corporate, and this is just another thing, is I've had so many good experiences placing corporate people, and I've seen people do so well in corporate. I'm just trying to think of a couple stories, but I had one woman recently that had been an attorney at a big law firm in Silicon Valley and had lost her job. I don't know why she'd lost her job, and it wasn't a good situation. And she'd been out of work for 6 months before she started looking again. And because Silicon Valley is a very kind of sophisticated market, they would prefer to hire someone that's employed, even though it's a good market to relocate into. And so I just decided to market her nationally. And she got, I don't know, 15 plus offers at working in smaller markets. We're talking about markets in the Midwest and I don't know, Phoenix and places like that. And so the point is that she was marketable all over because there just weren't a lot of people that had her experience. And I see that all the time. I see people that may have difficulty getting jobs in one market, but just because their training's so rare, they can relocate anywhere. Some people relocate to places like Savannah, Georgia, or anything. And if those same people were litigators, they would never get that interest, which is, to me, is very interesting. And it's just having that particular experience. And it's great. Corporate is a practice area. Any type of transactional practice area like that, if you have the experience, it can really change your career. One other thing I like about corporate for attorneys is that litigation can be difficult to develop a book of business in because you have to go out and pitch companies and so forth to do work for them and then to do different cases. And then those cases can go away. So unless you're representing people like Facebook and stuff and an ongoing litigation, it can be very difficult to consistently have to bring in litigation work. So it's hard for litigators. But corporate attorneys, what they do is they have relationships with different companies. So even corporate attorneys working in smaller markets will have relationships with companies in those smaller markets. So they're always getting called by the corporate clients, always doing ongoing kind of general advice for the corporate clients, things for them. And then in addition to that, when the corporate clients get sued, they'll call the corporate attorney, and the corporate attorney will refer the work to their company and to their firm and will refer the work internally. And law firms love corporate attorneys because corporate attorneys typically are the ones with the most business, and they throw off a lot of work to the real estate department, to every department within the firm. That's one reason they're very valuable, because of those relationships they have. And corporate work for companies tends to be ongoing. It's not one-off type things. Sometimes it is with capital markets type work and things, but for the most part, it's ongoing work. And so that's one reason that law firms like corporate attorneys so much, and one reason they're marketable. And it's the work itself it's not like litigation where there's a lot of drama and stuff involved. It tends to be it's very kind of complex clerical work, a lot of it that requires a certain type of thought process compared to litigation, and it's just different. And but corporate is a very good thing. It's difficult for law firms to hold on to corporate attorneys compared to litigators, because corporate attorneys always have the luxury of going in-house. Law firms love bringing in-house companies, love corporate attorneys much more than litigators. For litigation, they typically prefer to have the work done by outside attorneys, but for corporate attorneys, they like to do a lot of that work internally. So it's very difficult for law firms to hold on to corporate attorneys, and the majority of them end up going in-house, whereas litigators don't have that luxury as much. And so there's just typically much fewer corporate attorneys in the market with experience than there are litigators. And then patent prosecutors have always been in demand as long as I've been in this job that I've been doing for over 20 years. They're just, if they have electrical engineering or hard sciences backgrounds, computer science, then they're very marketable. Mechanical engineering less, and bio type stuff much less so as well. But pretty much anybody that I've ever represented as a patent prosecutor, if I work with them long enough, they'll always get a job. Even if they become senior, they can still get jobs. There's just a lot of opportunities out there for patent prosecutors, and they can pretty much always be guaranteed of finding something. And it's just one of the reasons is because of just the law of supply and demand. There's far fewer patent prosecutors, any type of attorney. You need to have a science background, and then you need to have training and how to write patents. And there's just not a lot of them. And because of that, especially in smaller markets, they can be very marketable. And a lot of the firms that do patent prosecution are small firms that don't particularly market themselves very well. So patent prosecution is a great practice area. It's very marketable, and it's anything that's niche like that. It's also a federal law, and because it's a federal before the Patent and Trademark Office, being admitted to the bar and stuff isn't that important. And I relocate every day of the week. Pretty much, I have patent prosecutors interviewing in markets outside of where they're from, and it's a great practice area if you want to be marketable. Some other practice areas that are important to consider are the most important things for being marketable are having skills that are in demand, but also that having skills where there's very few types of attorneys and where those skills are transferable. The problem with litigation is that the skills are in demand, but there's a lot of litigators, and the way that skills are transferable can really differ from one attorney to another. So one of the things I talk about, and I was giving a webinar for our recruiters right before this one, is I was talking about different types of attorneys and what makes them marketable to other markets. And so anytime you're going into a smaller market, which would be something like in any market outside of a major city, there's going to be fewer of you. And so there's going to be a lot more demand for you if someone like you comes along. And you might be like an education attorney, for example, and have a background in education law. If you want to relocate from Los Angeles to Sacramento, there's probably not a lot of education attorneys in Sacramento, and you'll probably get a pretty warm reception. If you want to relocate even to Los Angeles, there's not a lot of education attorneys in Los Angeles, and you can relocate from Sacramento. And so the idea is that anytime there's a skill that's highly in demand and there's not a lot of attorneys like that out there, law firms are going to be very interested in you, and that will allow you to relocate. You can relocate from all over the country to places like Nevada, like where there's not a lot of good attorneys with certain practice area experience, like real estate or patent prosecution or education law or other types of things, because there's just not a lot of people that want to move to Nevada as attorneys, and not a lot of attorneys in Nevada. The same thing goes with other smaller states like Delaware and so forth. So the more you think about where you want to relocate, you need to always consider the size market you want to relocate to, the number of attorneys doing what you want to do there, and keep all that kind of thing in mind when you're trying to do it. And if you really want to relocate, the biggest thing you can do really is be in a niche practice area. So you need to either be in a transactional practice area, or you want to be in a niche practice area where there's not a lot of people like you. And if there's not a lot of people like you out there, then it's going to be much easier for you to relocate than if there's a lot of attorneys out there that are just like you. And it's very common, by the way, for an attorney to think that they can relocate in certain practice areas when they can't. The final thing that I would say, and I will talk about this a little bit later as well, is that when you want to relocate, you need to really look like a specialist. So law firms really don't like generalists. The problem with the generalist is there's nothing special about a generalist. Most people do a lot of different things. And if your resume says you do criminal law, litigation, and real estate, the law firm, no one's going to be that interested in hiring you as a lateral. If your resume says you do immigration law, then they're going to be interested. If your resume says you do nothing but real estate law, they're going to be interested. So you need to take a look at your resume and figure out how to make it look like you're a specialist. Because if you don't look like a specialist, it's going to be very hard for any law firm to justify hiring you. They hire people that have special skills or unique skills at the lateral level. Or if you're in law school and applying places, they hire the best new attorneys that they can find, or the ones that will work for the least amount of money. Okay, so the best markets for relocation. So the best markets for relocation can be major cities many times. There's a couple different things that I would say. I would say that California, it can be a good market to relocate to at certain points in time when corporate is doing very well, but for certain practice areas. But for the most part, I don't really think it's as good as it used to be. I think the East Coast is always good, and Chicago can always be good. But in the recent past, this particular article that this PowerPoint is based on is not a new one, but it depends on your practice area. So when you're relocating, if you relocate to a large market, there's definitely going to be a lot more opportunities, but it may be difficult to get the best job possible many times there. But here's something to think about. So the state of California, just the state itself, represents 1/6 of the world's economy. So if you take the bar and move to California, it's typically going to be fairly easy to get a job in California. It's not, it's definitely, there's a lot of opportunity in California. I noticed I've had recruiters that have been recruiters on the East Coast, and they've done, the whole East Coast market, and then they start recruiting California, and they think they've died and gone to heaven because the firms are so much more receptive to people, and the firms are not as snobby in terms of the schools, and there's just a lot more of them, and there's just a lot more opportunity. So it's a very healthy, large economy, and if someone has the bar or they're in the right practice area, they can do very well. The best markets in California for transactional attorney is definitely Palo Alto. That market has just been on fire for forever, and it should be no surprise. That's where all these tech companies are. And so you have San Francisco, and then LA and Orange County are also good, and San Diego, especially for transactional practice areas. And so many attorneys, Orange County is very good, by the way, for litigation and real estate and construction. San Diego is growing and good for corporate. It's good, but it's very difficult to get a job in San Diego without the bar, but it's good for patent prosecution and other things. Los Angeles is a mid-market, so it's not as good of a market for corporate. It tends to be more litigation related. For whatever reason, Los Angeles has never been a great market for corporate, but Palo Alto and San Francisco have always been great markets. They're just, and I've never really, with the exception of some corporate slowdowns, they've always been very good. And it says here we serve more than 1,000 firms. It's actually more than probably 3,000 or 4,000 now, and it's huge. There's just a lot of demand there. And Palo Alto, the whole Silicon Valley region, is just very good odds of getting jobs there. There's just a lot of opportunity. The major firms there do a lot of hiring. It's just a great market. And if you have the bar exam, and you're pretty much, especially if you have good qualifications, you can get a job there. And then there's just even a lot of smaller firms, and it's just a great market, and it's just growing. It's when there's corporate layoffs and so forth, it slows down, but it's still growing, and there's firms setting up shop there every day. There's patent litigation. There's then all the other types of practice areas that come out of it. It's just a great market, and it's a good market to relocate to, the whole region. And San Francisco's a little bit more competitive because people want to live in San Francisco because it's a city, so people seem to like it a little bit more. And it's not as spread out, and so people like San Francisco a lot more. So it's a little bit more difficult, and people come to Palo Alto from all over the United States. And if you have experience in corporate or a New York law firm, you can pretty much get the New York law firm, be guaranteed a job there. And in terms of what it's like living there, there's a lot of commuting. The costs of living are very high. It's extremely high. It's more money to buy a house in the Castro district of San Francisco, which used to be considered like one of the worst areas. It's more money to buy a piece of property there than it is on the beach in Los Angeles County. It's just the price per square foot. It's very expensive, but property values go up a lot there too. So I know a lot of attorneys that bought property when they were young there, right out of school, and now they're like multimillionaires just from the property, not from the practice of law. San Francisco is more competitive. There's a lot of people that are drawn to it. It's just much easier to get a job in Palo Alto. And then corporate, like I said, for San Francisco and Palo Alto, corporate law, IP patent prosecution, employee benefits, immigration, other things like that tend to do very well there. But there's just a lot of demand there. There's a demand for labor and employment attorneys. There's demand for all sorts of attorneys in that market. There's a lot more patent prosecutors now there than there used to be. And it's a little bit more difficult to get a job as a patent prosecutor in those markets now, but it's still not that difficult compared to, it's still a much easier market. And the thing about California in general is the firms are just more open. I don't know how to explain it. They're more open than a lot of East Coast firms. The East Coast is a very sophisticated market, and it's very kind of staid, and there's not as many risks taken there as there are in the firms in the Bay Area, in particular in Los Angeles, and they're a little bit more risk averse, but in California more people get jobs. And then your other markets include on the East Coast would be like New York City, Washington D.C., Northern Virginia, Boston, Philadelphia. Those are all good markets for people relocating. It's very common for attorneys to move from Washington, D.C. to New York, and New York to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is very easy to wade into. A lot of times attorneys in Washington, D.C. will get jobs in Northern Virginia or Maryland. People move from Boston to New York and New York to Boston all the time. Philadelphia, It's a good market. Pittsburgh's a good market. All these markets up and down the East Coast are pretty good. And people tend to relocate more back and forth from those markets than they do from like the West Coast to them, or even the Midwest to them. But I move people from the Midwest to New York all the time, and New York to the Midwest, and those markets all the time. And New York's a good market. And the thing that's interesting about New York and Washington, D.C. is a lot of times if you were relocating to Chicago, people in Chicago would be like, why do you want to live in Chicago? Why are you moving to Chicago? But if you want to relocate to New York or Washington, D.C., the attorneys here just assume you'd want to live there. Like, why wouldn't you? They never even question, like, where are you going to live? Why would you live here? They just automatically open up. And there's not a lot of suspicion of outsiders like there might be in a lot of smaller markets. In Boston, a little bit, but in Philadelphia, a little bit, but not as much. And another move that's common too that I forgot to mention is people move from Los Angeles to the San Francisco Bay Area, and San Francisco Bay Area to Los Angeles and Orange County and stuff all the time. And they're not relocations, but they are an 8-hour drive, so they can be fairly far apart. And then New York and Washington, D.C. are good markets for people relocating. Washington, D.C. with corporate experience. New York it's interesting the way New York and Washington, D.C. work. So if you look at firms in New York City and you look at the bios of all the people there, the majority of them contain things dealing with corporate and corporate related work. And then there's always a much smaller litigation component. And if you look at the bios of the people at the big firms in Washington, D.C., the majority of them are going to have a lot of litigation related and policy and sometimes IP related stuff, but very few corporate people. So it's almost reversed the way they work, but that's how it worked. And then these are just some observations about a long period of time in terms of how New York typically works when the economy is very good. And this pattern from 2000 repeated itself in maybe 2012, and then again is repeating itself this year. So people that want to move from smaller markets to New York now are getting lots of interviews. And the same thing with California with corporate related openings as well. And New York has always been transient. It's people can relocate there if they have good qualifications. But New York is a very credentialed, especially in the large law firms, they're real credential snobs, and they take that in your experience very seriously. And the thing is, there's so many attorneys that want to work in New York that if you have something a little bit off or wrong with your background, the New York firms won't even talk to you because they have so many other people they can talk to that don't have anything wrong in their background. And even if it's not technically something wrong, if it looks like there's some suspicion about it or it doesn't look quite right, then the law firm just won't have anything to do with you. And Chicago is interesting too. It's a good market to relocate into, more so than New York or Washington, D.C. The firms do like you to have some sort of contact or contacts there, but you don't always need it. But most people that relocate to Chicago tend to be from the Midwest or have contacts in the Midwest, and it's just the way that market's always worked. They may have worked in another market and be coming back there. They tend to, when they relocate there, for what I've noticed more so than with a lot of other moves, they tend to relocate with a family or a significant other and join them there compared to other markets. And I don't know why that is. The Chicago market will often not slow down as much. Many times the big markets like New York and stuff and the Bay Area and Houston and others will slow down during recessions, and Chicago many times will kind of power through with continual hiring. But it's a little bit more conservative in relocations. It's not like they tend to look at people a little bit more closely. And I've seen a little bit more receptiveness to litigators and people relocating to Chicago than I have in other practice areas. But most people that relocate to Chicago, I think, do have some sort of connection. And then my favorite markets to relocate people into, really out of the major ones, are the smaller markets. And people in smaller markets it's very easy many times to relocate to smaller to mid-sized markets. So that's places like Seattle, which has gotten more popular recently, or Portland, or different areas of Arizona, or for a while, Austin was considered a small market. And then Florida, Michigan, even Grand Rapids, Michigan, Ohio, like just all these markets, New Orleans, all these markets out there, Alabama, like I can think all day long, that it's very easy for attorneys many times to relocate into those markets. And people are surprised all the time. I had one guy that was in New York that on a whim decided to apply with me to a firm, and he was a litigator and had been looking in New York for months, and decided on a whim and not a great litigator, but not getting any interviews, and decided on a whim to apply to a firm in New Orleans, like a big firm there, and got a job. And it was a dream come true for him because he was taking the bus like 2 hours a day each way into the city and back. and having to get up at 5 in the morning to catch the bus. The thing is that many attorneys do not choose to work in smaller markets. I think working in a smaller market, in my opinion, is one of the smartest things an attorney can do, because there's not a lot of competition for the same jobs if you're a good attorney. So law firms are much less likely to get rid of people. People tend to stick around very long. They tend to develop contacts in the community. They tend not to have to work as hard to hold on to their jobs like you would in a major market, and many times have much better careers than you would otherwise have working in major markets. And I tell this story all the time, but when I clerked for a federal judge in Michigan, in Bay City, which is near Midland and Flint and some other places. And I remember all the young people that would come in that were my age back then, working in the firms there. And this is over 25 years ago. All the people that were working there, and they're still with the same small firms, most of them. And they were young, and I used to meet them all, and we would go out and stuff. I don't think anyone I know from law school is at the same firm, except maybe the valedictorian from my class is a partner at the firm he joined. But it's just the people stick with the firm. The smaller markets are less likely to get rid of you. Your career is more likely to develop. People protect each other. They're not always getting overwhelmed with applications. And so I just really like small markets. And if I had to do it over again, and I really wanted to work somewhere in a law firm for the long haul, I would seriously think about it. I just think attorneys are often much, much happier when they take jobs in smaller markets. And they just seem to have much better careers in the long run and stick with it, and not the same stresses and the people often have in larger markets. I can't say enough good things about them. And if you have specialized skills, then many times it's not as difficult to move to a smaller market. And any smaller market that you can think of is a place you could potentially work, especially if you have contacts in that market. Any type of family there, or someone you know from there, or you went to school there, or I don't know what it would be, but smaller markets are great. And the thing is, it's all about supply and demand, because a smaller market is not receiving as many applicants. And the more specialized attorney you are, the more likely you are to be able to get a job there, because people like you don't come along very often. And there's just can be a feeding frenzy. I've seen instances where I have a specialized type of attorney, and I decide to market them to, I don't know what an example would be, like Omaha, Nebraska, which is a real legal market. And there might only be like 8 or 9 really good firms there. And then there's probably like another 15 that are pretty good as well. And someone gets 15 interviews if they're the kind of person that doesn't come along very often. That's how it works in smaller markets. And then you tend to often have, if the firm is established, there's firms in smaller markets that have been there 100 plus years, then you're also going to have a lot of employment stability, because they're going to be working with a lot of the top firms there. Seattle's a good market. It's always been a good market. The firms are trying to open offices there. Most big firms are. It's a great market. Denver's a good market, and that's not a smaller market. Phoenix really isn't a smaller market anymore. But just your qualifications will really make you stick out in smaller markets. And so the depression that you might be feeling about the job market, trying to work in a major market, it can be just, if you're in a niche practice area, trying to get a job in a major market, your odds of getting a position in a smaller market are just astronomically better. And you're actually going to probably be a lot happier. Your cost of living is going to be less, and your taxes are going to be less. And it's just be able to buy a house and have weekends off. I just don't get it. Attorneys are so driven, especially many times ones that went to great law schools and are competitive with their classmates, and I don't know, but I really like smaller markets. I see people relocate to smaller markets all the time and just have incredible luck. I've seen recently family law attorneys relocating from just these little tiny markets or big markets to little markets. We had one person, there was a bidding war for her in a small market in Wisconsin who was a family law attorney. And it's just, I love small markets. And if it was me and you have any concerns about what market you're going to work in, one thing I would say is most of the work that people do is just sitting behind a desk. It's not, is it really worth it to go through all the stress of working in a big market to say that I work in this market and then have to go home to a studio apartment every night and work crazy hours and be stressed out, have health problems, and I don't know? Or would you rather be happy and a big fish in a small pond? Attorneys if you're an attorney in a market like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, I was talking to our recruiters just now, and I said, I was talking about how common attorneys are, and I could walk out my front door and almost anywhere in Los Angeles, and find an attorney within 3 minutes. It would be very easy to find an attorney. I could walk out into the street and just start waving my hands and say, the first person who pulls over and shows me proves they're an attorney, I'll give $1,000 to. And I would probably find someone within within a minute. There's attorneys all over. If you work in a smaller market, literally a minute. If I was to do that on the street of New York, it would probably be less than 15 seconds before someone would, maybe not even that. So the point is, when you work in a smaller market, attorneys are actually respected, and people will call you counselor. It's very funny. Everyone will say you're an attorney. Everyone will respect you because you're an attorney. All sorts of people will ask you questions about just various legal disputes they have. Say they think it's remarkable that they know an attorney. It's true, and they'll feel very proud to know an attorney, and they'll respect you, and you'll get the best tables, and it's very funny what it's like being an attorney in a smaller market compared to a big market. And in New York or Los Angeles, no one cares you're an attorney. It's actually probably a bad thing. Like, it's because it's going to say that you don't have a huge business. I don't know, but it's very funny. So smaller markets are a great place to work, and it's just and you're respected for being an attorney, and you have more opportunities. It's easier to get business. You have to work fewer hours. There's just so many benefits, and it's easier. You have more employment security many times, and the only benefit, I guess, is you don't get to go to the opera. I mean, I don't know, but no one's going to the opera now anyway. So I don't really, or you don't have to have a big sports team. You have to watch it on TV, but in some of these markets you do. But if it was me, I would seriously consider smaller markets. I see people going into smaller markets all the time, and really their life never being the same and being much happier. And I don't know what the market is for you. It could be Boise, Idaho, but there's just a lot of great opportunities out there for people. And the problem with very large markets is large markets are very efficient. So they are going to squeeze everything they possibly can out of you. And if they can't do it, they'll find someone else they can do it with, and they'll get rid of you. And you're much more expendable, and the value system's different. Things are more expensive. Taxes in New York are very expensive. Taxes in California are very expensive. And so the firms will squeeze everything out of you they can. The cost of living's higher. The amount of work you need to do to cover the expenses for the firm is more. More is expected out of you. You need to be more of a specialist as opposed to a generalist. There's all sorts of, they can find people very easily to work there because there's attorneys everywhere. There are so many attorneys in large markets. I wish I could I don't think I probably would have a very hard time going into any restaurant in the Los Angeles area on a Friday or Saturday night and being the only attorney there if there's more than 25 people in the room. It would be probably almost impossible. It might happen, but there's just so many people willing to take your job and stuff in large markets. So if you go to a smaller market, you can really develop a niche. You can develop a group of people that will protect you. And that's what happens in a lot of smaller firms. Those people have worked in smaller markets. They work together with the whole career. I'm not saying that a smaller market is necessarily the best for everyone. Certainly my whole career and most of the placements I make are in the largest markets. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with them. But what I would encourage everyone on this call, whether or not you're a law student or you're an attorney looking for a job, is to think about what is important to you, because the value systems in smaller markets and your long-term opportunities are often much different. And the drawbacks of smaller markets are often the fact that if you do lose your job, it can be difficult to find a new one many times, but often not. If you do something wrong, you're very bad, then your career is going to be, you're going to have to move many times. If you want to go in-house, it's going to be more difficult to do there. But those are some of the negatives. But I believe that the positives outweigh them, that far too many people stress themselves out and are unnecessarily worrying about how they look in other people's eyes in large markets, and really end up having very unfulfilling lives and careers that might be much different if they were someplace with different value systems. That's just my thought. And I think I'm right about this because I've been watching people practice law for several decades now, and that's what I've noticed. And there are people, by the way, in large markets that are extremely happy and that are doing very well and are at the top of their game and have found their place in small firms and mid-sized firms and large firms and are happy. But for the most part, I think the happiness quotient and how do you enjoy practicing law and able to stick with it the longest is typically much higher in smaller markets. And final point that I'll make is I see people go to New York in particular all the time. and Palo Alto to a great extent. And these very talented attorneys that go to the best law schools, that get jobs in the best firms and have had the best lives, and they go to these firms and many times they work there and then they get so stressed out by the fact that it's impossible to make partner no matter how much they work. Nothing is going to matter, that unless they bring in a giant public corporation, they're never going to make partner, that they never have time for themselves, that all they feel is criticized, and that they never get positive feedback. And then these people drop out of the practice of law. And then for decades, they talk about, oh, I worked at such and such a big firm, but they never practice law again, or they do something that's beneath them, or their self-esteem is shot. And I don't like that. I don't like when the best people that have their confidence shocked, when that wouldn't have happened to them necessarily in a small market. If they'd gone there, they would be a superstar. And I had a couple interesting things happen when I was in college. I know one guy that I was friends with was this genius from a smaller town in Ohio, I think, and he went to the University of Chicago. And his first semester, he'd gotten a 5 on his AP chemistry and all this stuff, and gotten great SATs. So his first semester, he took the hardest chemistry class he could that the school would let him take, and he got a D. And he realized that he wasn't going to go to medical school, and all this stuff was because of this horrible grade. And then he just dropped out and started smoking weed all the time and never recovered. And I saw another guy in my college that was the valedictorian of a small high school in Oklahoma that also went there. And he ended up getting not being able to compete, not being ready for it, and ended up turning into an alcoholic and eventually killing himself. The point is that, and these are sad stories, but the point is that when you put yourself in an environment that's extremely demanding of you, and where you're not going to get the kind of feedback you want, it can hurt you. And there's no reason that you have to keep up. If I wanted to suddenly become a professional football player at my age, and I based my whole identity about being able to do that, and I tried to try out for a major league football team, I couldn't try out, but if saying I really was able to, I would get destroyed. And if I based my whole identity on that, would be a real mistake. I would be much better off trying to play club football at the local something or other. So you don't need to be in the biggest markets. You don't need to be in the biggest firms. You don't need to do all this. And you oftentimes are going to be much happier when you seriously consider trying to work in those types of markets. The only thing I would say is that I help people relocate all the time. The majority of the people that I work with, if you're one of our candidates listening, I think one of the smartest things you can do is always add additional markets to your search with us. The more markets you're looking at, the better off you are. And I think that I certainly understand relocating people. One other thing I did want to bring up that I think is important to understand about relocating is many times when you're looking in your market, the law firms are a little suspicious of you. So if you're say you're located in Cleveland and you're looking for a job there. Law firms in Cleveland, if you start looking for a job in Cleveland, are going to wonder, is this person having problems at their existing firm? Is there something wrong? Are there going to be problems with us if we hire them? And they're going to be a little suspicious. But if you're relocating from Cleveland to Chicago and you say, I grew up in Chicago, or my husband or my wife is from Chicago and we want to settle down there, all of a sudden the firms in Chicago are going to think, oh, wow, okay, that's great. So the person's coming here, they're from here, they're likely to settle down. So that's awesome. They'll be more interested in you. So law firms like people that are relocating, especially when you have a connection to that area. And as a connection, what I mean by that is you want to, if you have some family there, or if you have lived there in the past, or there's just some reason for you to be there, law firms really like that. And that gives them many times a really good reason to hire you and bring you on. They want that connection, and the connection, what they're looking for is they're looking for someone that's going to come there and settle down and hopefully not leave, because it's a lot of work hiring people. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break, and then when I come back, just as many questions as everyone has, whether it's about this or anything else with your career, and any questions, and we'll go from there. All right, we'll get started. Just give me 1 second here. I'm going to pause something. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second here, because there was something I did want to open and share with everyone. All right, so I will start with questions. Let me just see here. Yeah, and 1 second here, sorry. So let me get the questions here, and then I will get started. Okay, so the first question is, One of your articles, I saw that you mentioned a top 10 law student who stuck out at LJ would probably not be a great hire for a smaller firm. I can understand that, but as someone who wants to move up as much as possible, how can I still get my foot in the lower rungs of the ladder? I don't know why someone, I would say this, I've certainly written a lot over the years, so why I would say that someone that, oh, so how else can you get your lower rungs of the ladder? Okay, well, the big thing that I always recommend for people is, and a lot of people do not follow my advice for whatever reason, and it's not the best idea, but the best thing you can do is if you're always going to try to move up, that's okay. The law firm will make money from you when you show up and they start billing you up by the hour. And so that's fine. And you're trading your time for money. So it's not like you owe any type of allegiance to stay wherever you go. And you can certainly keep moving up to better and better firms. What I would recommend is to really try to apply to as many places as you possibly can. There's so many firms out there where anybody can work. Every market, there's countless firms where you possibly could work. And now, I don't know if you're a law student or not, but if you are a law student, then you certainly can potentially find lots of different places to look. And you should be looking at as many possible firms as you can. And just doing the research, not necessarily applying to the places where everybody else is applying. One of the things I don't like about job openings is when there's a job opening, what tends to happen in a lot of firms is everybody's applying to the same job openings. And so if everyone's applying to the exact same job openings, then your odds of getting the position are much worse than if you're not applying to a job opening. So you're often better off just applying to firms that don't have openings, because if they don't have openings, you're the only person that's showing up there. And it's much easier to bring you in and hire you than it is to go out and recruit for someone and have to review all sorts of resumes and stuff. That's one piece of advice that I have that I hope helps. Let's see here. These are all great questions, and just ask as many as you guys have, and I will continue answering them. Let's see here. I complete a 1-year clerkship in a random small market. Would that be enough to help me break into a major market? I'm already at a top law school, but I didn't do a summer associateship. Yep, that's enough. So if you're at a top law school and you didn't work as a summer associate, it's okay, especially now during this pandemic. If you do a 1-year clerkship, federal clerkship in any small market, yes, you can get into a big market. Now, New York City and DC are very difficult markets to break into for litigators, because those are markets where there's an oversupply of litigators. But there's plenty of big firms in other markets where you could potentially work. But certainly New York is one of them. And there's lots of small markets where you could work as a federal clerk. The reason law firms like federal clerks is because it gives you the opportunity. It's a prestigious honor, of course, but more than anything, you're working with a judge for a year, and they're reviewing your work. You're doing a lot of writing, and it makes you better. I don't know where I would have been at, honestly. If having done a clerkship was actually very helpful for me. And I did it in a random smaller market, and I got a lot of good training, and it was a very good thing that I did. I think it can make you definitely a good hire. Okay. What are some things I can say to a smaller firm from a top 10 graduate to convince them to get hired? So the thing with the smaller firms is, in every market, there's smaller firms. If you went to a top 10 law school, in almost every market, there's going to be smaller firms with their other graduates of top 10 law schools. It doesn't matter where you are. You could be in upstate New York. You could be in, I don't know, a suburb 45 miles outside of a major city where there's not a lot of people, but there's top 10 graduates at firms all over the country. So if you want to work with other good top 10 graduates or top 20 graduates, you can always find a position in a firm where there's other people like you, and you can say that I'm looking forward to work in a smaller firm, to less stress, to a more collegial environment, to everything. And you have to think about what it is about why you'd want to work in a smaller market. But if you can come up with good reasons for that, then in a smaller firm that are going to appeal to that firm, then that's good. Your reasons for working with a small firm shouldn't necessarily have anything to do with not liking large firms. They should have to do with conscious decisions that you made, that you want to have more client contact, for example. So smaller firms will have more client contact, that you want to get more individualized training with attorneys as opposed to working with a lot of different people, that you want to, all sorts of things. And you shouldn't go in trying to convince people that's really what you want to do if you don't. But if you do want to do something like that, then you have to come up with the reasons and get yourself psyched up to do that, and think about how you can do that. Okay. A lot of people are having issues getting summer jobs this year. So I would say if you're in that category, you're not alone, because I've been seeing these questions at every single one of these meetings. Let's see here. I want to be a litigator in a small major market with failed this summer associate position. I'm at a top law school. Will this be a permanent ding in my record that keeps me from being a litigator top firm? Absolutely not. All sorts of people don't get summer jobs and then do very well. All sorts of people end up not getting even good jobs after they graduate and move up. And it doesn't, none of this really matters in the long run. You can still work at a smaller firm over the summer, and you should try to find a job doing that. You can get other types of positions with law firms. The only thing that the reason people don't necessarily get summer associate jobs is it's difficult when you're a new attorney and when you're a law student to walk into interviews and know how to behave. You don't know necessarily how to talk to other attorneys. You don't know how to interview. You don't know how to, you may not have the grades you wanted. You don't know necessarily what law firms are looking for. So people that aren't able to secure summer associate positions, or you just may be competing with better people or the lottery and the firms you're talking to. I actually recommend that a lot of people that are looking for summer associate jobs try to every year that they try to do other things other than look at their go through OCI, because if you don't get a job through OCI, where does that leave you? So you should also be applying maybe to firms and markets where you're not from, where you have connections, and seeing if you can get a job that way as well. But no, it's not going to be a permanent ding in your record. The getting a job in a law firm and your legal career is a long race. Right now, let's say you're 21 years old. I know people that are practicing that are 95, and I know I've placed people in their 80s. So that's three times as long as you've been alive that I've placed people. So in large firms. So you can definitely still get a job. It's just everything is a race. These are great questions. My law students had an extraordinarily difficult time getting a job in a law firm. I interviewed well before law school and getting jobs, but always do or say something wrong in my law firm interviews. I've been unable to secure a law firm job despite 15 plus screeners in OGI and 4 callbacks. I recently got rejected from a screener for a small firm in a market where I'm not from. How can I figure out what I'm doing wrong? I've been following these seminars and trying to incorporate advice, but it hasn't worked out for me. Okay, you need to keep reading all the articles and so forth on BCG that I've written about interviewing in particular. So I would coming to these seminars and stuff is very helpful, but I would recommend reading articles that I've written and learning more about it. By the way, 15 screeners and 4 callbacks after 15 screenings is actually very good. That's not bad. I wouldn't say you're having an extraordinarily difficult time. I would say that you're actually doing just fine, and you've probably just been unlucky. The 4 questions that law firms, there's actually 4 or 5 questions that law firms are asking when they hire you. And I do this every week, but I do want to do it again because it's very important, is if you can do the job. And this just means your education, skills, can you be managed? Will you do the job long term? Do you want the job? And do we like you? So can you do the job? There's all sorts of things that kind of go into that calculus. And let me try to pull something up here if I can from I had yesterday. Let's see, give me 1 second. Okay, so I don't know exactly what you're doing wrong, but let me just, this is just another document that I did for a recruiting meeting yesterday, and I'm just trying to see if there's anything here that would help you. The big thing is that most attorneys do when they come across in the wrong way is when they're interviewing, especially younger people, is they may look like they don't want the job enough. So sometimes they don't come across as really wanting to work there, which can be difficult. So that's one of the things that I notice is they just think that the law firm, if they show up and do the interview and they have the qualifications like the law school and so forth, that the law firm's going to hire them. But the law firm really wants to hire people that really want to work there. And so that means trying to really connect and look like you want to work there. And you may not want to work there. There was sometimes when people don't want to work somewhere and they're unsure about it, it comes across and they just don't have the confidence. I don't know what it is. And so they look and they say they don't get the jobs and they're like, well, I did everything I'm supposed to. Their heart's not in it. And so your heart needs to be in it in order for it to work. And your heart might not be in it. And I don't know, but that can happen. And if you really want the job, it will come across and you'll convince people that you really want to work there. I had an experience once when I was interviewing for a summer associate job, and it was the job that I really wanted. And I was in New York, and I was in a elevator, and I was adjusting my tie, and a woman looked at me, and I was watching me adjust my tie, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm adjusting my tie. I've got a really important interview. I really want this job. I hope I do well." And she said, "Good luck." And I said, "Thanks." And she smiled at me. And then when I got into the interviews, it turned out she was the hiring partner of the firm, which was the best thing that possibly could have happened to me. And I ended up getting the job. And so she really understood right there and then that I wanted the job, which is a funny story. And I think she also probably liked me because I showed that I was vulnerable. We like you. You have to try to make some sort of connection with people. You have to smile and you have to make them, want to work with you and like you and think that you can connect with them and that they trust you and so forth. And so you have to ask yourself what are you thinking about this job? What are you thinking? What is it? Are you thinking about the people that you are interviewing with? Are you liking them? Because if they like you, then and that's good. My father, by the way, he was in the CIA, and he was talking to one of his handlers one time and telling him about someone that he was following or spying on or something. And my dad always told me the story, and he said that my dad was telling him about how he didn't like the person, and even though he was someone he was supposed to connect with, and the guy stopped him right there and he's, "Don't think it or you'll show it." And I thought that was very interesting. So he's saying if you think something, people are going to pick up on what you're thinking, and that's not a good thing. So if you think it, you'll show it. So that's the thing: is, are you thinking positive thoughts about these people? Are you thinking negative thoughts? Are you thinking I'm going to do this job for a couple of years and then figure something else out? What are you thinking? Are you talking about yourself too much in interviews? Because people are when they're looking for people to hire, they're looking for soldiers. And so the soldiers is someone that will carry out orders. This is for young people. Carry out orders and do the work and not make trouble. And then soldiers also, and then people that do the job long term, do not have a lot of stuff in their background that looks like they may want to do something else. And do we like you mean you're affable and smile, easy to get along. So a lot of wanting a job is if you're able to, if you really want the position, then most of the time people are going to pick up on that, and you're going to smile and do all these things instinctively. So you need to think yourself into getting the job, and that's really the thing I would recommend. And I personally don't think this is that bad. I think just not getting the jobs with the callbacks is unfortunate, but you just need to keep learning. You should go on more and more interviews, and you need to keep growing from this process, and you're going to do fine. There's nothing you wouldn't have gotten the 4 callbacks if you weren't doing a good job of the screen. So you're obviously coming across in the right way. I for a couple of years, several years ago, I called up. I wanted to hire some new attorneys to work for me and to help with some legal work. So I called, I think it was UCLA, and which is a great law school, and they have a lot of great people come out of there, and asked them if there were people that I could interview and then I called them maybe in the fall that hadn't had jobs yet. And so I interviewed a bunch of them. I interviewed maybe 10 or 15 of them, and they'd sent me, or maybe it wasn't quite that many, it was 7 or 8. The people that I interviewed, I could tell most of the time didn't really want the work. They weren't in it. They weren't enthusiastic. They would come in and they would look at you suspiciously, and they wouldn't connect, and they would have a very bad handshake. And there were just things that were off. They were more in their head. And that's what I noticed. And these are the people that didn't get jobs. I don't know what UCLA's rank, but I'm sure it's a pretty highly ranked law school. So those are the people that weren't getting jobs. And so I think that one guy I just remembered couldn't smile and didn't make eye contact. Another woman was smiling but was looking all over the place and seemed non-committal. And so the people I ended up hiring, there was always something there was always something off, and you could tell really that they didn't really want the work, and that was the big problem. And so you have to really convince yourself that this is something you want. And there's a saying in the book Think and Grow Rich that when somebody's ready for something, they put on the appearance of being ready for it. And what that means is you need to work yourself up into a frenzy that you want something. And when you do, what you're looking for will appear and you'll get it. That's a good book, by the way, that I recommend everyone read. It's called Think and Grow Rich, and it's how your mind, and you can get it for free online. Think and Grow Rich. It's just basically how people use their mind, and your mind. You can get anything you want. You can get money. You can get You can become a famous politician. You can do anything, but you have to be ready for it, and you have to work your mind up into a state where you're going to have and possess that thing. And that's what the most successful people do. They're able to use self-talk and things to get it. So if you really want to work in a law firm, you can. When I had a similar, not great record when I was interviewing with law firms when I was younger, and then I decided it was something I really wanted to do. And then suddenly I was going into, this is after my clerkship, but I would go into interviews and I was a completely different person. And you'll be a different person after you work yourself up. Everybody on this call will be, but you need to get yourself in a state where you're just completely fired up and you want to do this thing, because that's who people hire. People hire people that want the job, that come across that are almost like glowing and just excited, and it makes them appear like this source of energy, because you're not just selling your skills, you're selling energy. That's the thing. People sell skills and also their energy. One that's all fired up, that's energy. I certainly have a lot of energy in what I'm doing here. And it's not just skills. I'm sure there's other people that know the stuff I do, but there are other people, do they have the energy and excitement about it? And you have to be excited about something to get it. And it's the same thing with jobs. You can, if you have the right energy, you can really get anything. And especially if you want the job. So I would recommend Think and Grow Rich. I don't know what else to tell you, but to leave you with that, and then to focus that on a goal. Okay. And I hope that helps, because I know that's probably a very important question for you. And not a town office, no, you're moving there for the job. I've heard they're less likely to hire because they feel bad if you have to go through all the trouble and they aren't even sure they'll keep you. So is it better to say you already live in that town? No, you shouldn't say you already live in the town. And you're right. If you're not from the area and you're looking for a job earlier in your career, you're going to have a much harder time getting hired in an area where you're not from. If it's a smaller town, then if they're unsure, they'll keep you. No, you shouldn't say you live in that town, because they'll know people and they'll know all towns have various things associated with them. But if you tell people that you'd be willing to move there for a job and you're just trying to find the best job you can, they'll respect that. And if there's things that you like about the job then, or the firm, then that's also good. But yeah, if the firms are businesses, they hire the best people they can get, and then they use these things, like they hire the best people they can get. And so the only thing that they're concerned about is they're concerned with these 4 questions. And so if you can answer these 5 questions, if you can answer these questions, even if you're from out of town, if you seem like they like you more and you want the job more and you're more committed than other people, then they're more likely to hire you. But you should never lie in an interview about something like saying you live in a town, and that's crazy. So if you go, there's a thing on BCG Attorney Search called the BCG Reference Guide to Practice Areas, or something along those lines, and you can apply by motion to a lot of states. After you've been admitted for several years, there's not most states, California does, but most states don't even make you take the bar. It's not that difficult. A lot of great questions. Thank you. Summer approaches, I was curious as to what a typical Big Law summer experience is like. Most are virtual. I was wondering what the logistic culture standard in a Big Law summer experience. Phones or the per experience. That's, do you have any clue what to expect? Just curious. Okay, so this is a good question. So so there's an article that I wrote on Law Crossing Court, I think, called "A Guide to Being a Summer Associate." It's a long article, and something along those lines. But let me just tell you what I've noticed in my career about summer associate jobs. The most important thing with summer associate jobs are to show the firm that they can make money off you. So let me just basically to show the law firm that in the long run, they'll be able to make money off you. So let me just show you what the kind of the questions that they're going to ask, that they're looking for. So the only people that I've seen not get offers in summer associates are people that do the following. They have a sense of entitlement. So when I was a summer associate, it was interesting because the economy was very bad. One guy ordered most expensive meals at dinners, no offer. Another guy took car home every night, no offer. Back then you had the firm spend a lot of money for cars. Other people did not bill a lot. Another guy, when I was clerking, another guy got drunk and so this kind of stuff is just, and then most people that do not get offers. Do not. These are questions that they're asking. So the biggest way to not get an offer is basically and then other people are not thorough. So all this stuff is fixable. Basically, you have to act extremely appropriately in your summer associate. I guess it's virtual, but you have to just treat everyone with massive deference. Otherwise, you're going to upset people. You cannot expect cannot spend a lot of the firm's money, not because you can't, just because they won't like it and it'll make you look stupid. So you need to be careful with that. And then you just getting loaded and acting out socially is really huge. And that's something that every year at every firm, there's people that usually don't get offers that do that. And then law firms that do not give everyone offers want to see who's going to work the hardest. Who's going to work the hardest. So you need to really just bill a lot of hours, as many as you can within reason. You don't need to kill yourself, but if you're like in the top, 15 or 20% of the billers, you'll probably definitely get an offer. That's the thing that they're most concerned about. And then other people are not thorough, which means use Grammarly and other things and double check your work. Most new attorneys are not familiar with doing that, but you need to do the best work you're capable of. And then you also need to ask senior associates and others for guidance, even mid-level associates, guidance and ask questions about what to do. And they do not expect you to be perfect right away, but those are big things to do. And then no sense of entitlement. So just because this is not your opportunity to get rewarded for doing well in college and going to a good law school, this is your opportunity to show people that you can go to the next step. And these are the things you need to do to go to the next step. And then the only other thing is just no gossip. You should assume all emails are read. Emails, etc., will be read by a superior, read by someone in the firm. Not that will happen, but just assume that will happen. And then the only other thing would be no personal relationships or no romantic, which is difficult for people to not do. But that would be my advice. It's not going to prevent you from getting an offer, but it could definitely hurt you. And whatever you do, no inappropriate text or anything like that to staff and so forth, because people will use that against you and be very excited to do that. I don't mean that in a negative way against them. It's just that's how you don't want to give people anything to use against you. So those are the big things that I would say. That kind of goes for working in any firm, but those are the big mistakes that I've seen people make as summer associates. And then these are questions that they're going to be asking. Okay, so currently involved in a really niche practice group where our firm reigns supreme. Great. Looking up, I see lots of capable folks getting very senior associate and getting turned down for partnership. The goal is to be an equity partner. I'm currently a secondary one. Other actually discuss the merits of there. I think it's make our hands by staying the current firm, make counsel, become a senior associate at a big law firm, and then selling experience in a minute or having a lower rank, big law, taking a pay cut, moving back markets, moving to mid-size, start building relationships. Okay, these are all good questions. So I think that it sounds like if a firm's not making partners, it's just because they don't have to. So firms will only make you a partner if they have to make you a partner. And the only reason a firm would have to make you a partner is if they're going to lose a lot of money by you leaving. And it sounds to me like they have a lot of people that want to work there and brand. And so they have plenty of people that are going to make it easy for them to make it easy for them to continually make money. So the only way you can possibly make partner there and be an equity partner anywhere is if you are able to, or if the firm cannot find anyone like you, anyone else, that would be the only way you could do that. So what that means is you could move to a smaller market, move to a smaller firm, do that, or you can start bringing in business. I don't know exactly what it is you do, but if you bring in business, then the firm obviously will make more money with you than without you. The business is great for them because what a firm does is if you have like $4 million in business, they can pay you $1.5 million, and then the $2.5 million is extra money for them and so forth. So, the business is really, and then they don't want you to leave. Or the other option would be to get very close to the biggest rainmaker and become absolutely indispensable. To that person. If you become absolutely indispensable, and hopefully that person's older, and they give you their business when they leave. That's how a lot of people make partner in large firms. They take over the books of business of more senior people, and when they leave, and then they become equity partners. And so I've seen a lot of people do stuff like that. Your odds of becoming a partner at another firm, if you're able to, it sounds like if you're staying in your current top-ranked law firm and making counsel is a big deal, then you're probably at one of 10 firms I can think of. And I think you could definitely sell your experience to a mid or lower ranked firm, or move to a lower ranked big law firm, or move markets. I would start, if you're a mid-level associate, I would think about potentially looking around right now just to be safe and seeing what the market looks like, because if you move to a market like that's a smaller to mid-sized market, then you could be one of the only people in that market doing that sort of work, and that could be very profitable for you profitable for that firm from a business standpoint. The situation you're in right now, there's just too many people that you're competing with for the same job, and they have no problem hiring people to do what you're doing. So there's no incentive for them to really make you a partner. And that's just how it works. Your only option in that situation is really to think about looking. Okay, for the past 3 or 4 months, I've noticed my work product hasn't been, my motivation for this job in general is dipping. I read about the itch after 2 years in big law, and my third year now, and definitely can relate to a lot of this. I find myself just disengaged from the work and losing interest. I thought I was burnt out at the end of 2020, but I went on 2 vacations in January, and it just seemed to turn me off even further. How do you push through? How do you keep yourself engaged and motivated? I want to pursue part and see how it goes, but it's so far away, it doesn't drive me day to day. All right, well, that's a great question, and I've got a pretty sad answer for you. So I've come to the conclusion at this point in my life, after decades of trying to do things that I didn't want to do, that you should either say, that's not going to say, oh, yeah, I'll just say, hell yeah, you want to do something, and if it's not hell yeah, then, and I would like to use another term, but I'm not going to. If it's not hell yeah, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. If you want to, it's like, so an example would be, if you want to marry someone, a lot of people get married because they're like, oh, it's the right thing to do, or or I can't do any better, or no, it needs to be, people do it for the wrong reason. So if you want to do something, you should be like 100% convinced, like 100% convinced, this is the person for me. This is what I want. This is great. I have no doubts. I'm totally sold. This is great. And it's the same thing with a job. What I'm doing, I think, hell yeah, I love this. I don't want to do anything else. But if I was practicing law, I wouldn't be hell yeah. So you need to do something that motivates you to do something where you do say hell yeah every day. Everyone needs a career where they're saying hell yeah. And it's just the way it works. And if your work product's suffering, how are you going to make partner with bad work product and no motivation? You don't have that hell yeah factor. So there's something that you're interested in doing that's probably not this. Now, it could be the firm, it could be where you're working, but you're not saying hell yeah. You're saying, I don't know. And that's like someone like dating someone they don't like. Oh, this person's okay, but they're not, whatever. That's the issue, is your self-esteem. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. It's just like your self-esteem should tell you you deserve better. So that's just the way it is. And you do deserve better. You should be doing something that motivates you and gets you excited, and not something where you're just kind of saying, I don't like it. Now, maybe that's practicing law in another firm. Maybe it's doing something else altogether. But nothing ever good happens if you don't say hell yeah. The attorneys that I know, the best, that really do what they do, they're insane. And they're up at 4 a.m, or if they're not up at 4 a.m, they're up at 7 and they're working till midnight. You have to love what you're doing. And if you don't love what you're doing, you're not going to be able to push through. Now, there's nothing wrong with, if you need to, doing something you don't like, but it sounds to me like you're in a freaking prison camp. And what's the point? Nothing good happens to people that are not excited about what they want to do. And I don't like it. And it could be an itch. The other thing is too, and I will bring this up because it's important. There's a lot of people that are dabblers. So people are dabblers in a lot of things. So people dabble at practicing. They dabble at hobbies, they dabble at all sorts of things. Hobbies, they dabble in relationships, they dabble in health and fitness. And so nothing good ever happens to dabblers. So it's not good being a dabbler. You need to commit. But you don't commit to something that you don't like. So if you're going to be like really good at tennis, then you freaking practice tennis every single day and you get good at it, and you're no longer a dabbler. If you're going to be really good at anything, you have to do it consistently and you have to do it all the time. And then you're not a dabbler. But the problem with dabblers is they never get good at anything. So I'm not certainly suggesting you become a dabbler and not do this, but I am suggesting that if you're going to be good, you have to do it all the time and you have to love it. And if you don't, then you're going to be then you're a dabbler, and it's not good. And you have to be excited about whatever you're doing. And I apologize for that. Maybe you're not well or something, or maybe you need to reorganize your life, but you need to get excited about what you're doing. Okay, this is another great question. These are great questions today. Okay, elite litigation boutiques often recruit associates by promising a better chance of making partner. But does partnership with these boutiques actually stack up to partnership with a large rank law firm? The answer is no. Most elite litigation boutiques do not have the leverage or do not make as much money as smaller firms make as much larger firms because there's not as much leverage. And so because of that, you typically will not make as much money. You will often be responsible for doing more things and all sorts of things. So but sometimes they actually have lower cost structures and there is more opportunity and so forth. But it's just different to being a partner at a large law firm than it is at being at a elite litigation boutique. And you may be able to have a better chance of making partner. That's definitely true. But at the same time, becoming a partner at an elite litigation boutique may make it more difficult to attract larger clients many times because larger clients typically, when things are very serious, won't often use a boutique. Sometimes they will. Obviously, they do a lot, but it can often be much easier to bring people into to larger firms than others. So, a tax attorney with 5 years of LLM experience coming from a small market and going to their small or large market. So the thing with tax attorneys, it's very difficult many times for tax attorneys to get positions with large law firms. And the reason is because large law firms, the tax departments of large law firms are most often servicing the corporate department for the most part. Not all the time, but for the most part, that's what they're doing. So they're almost like this ancillary group that comes in different transactions and so forth in order to get things done. So when you relocate to a smaller, large market, what tax attorneys should do and what they don't always do is you should be searching for firms in those markets that do only tax related, or have primarily do tax related work. And there's firms that do that in all markets. And you should also be looking but you should always try to look for firms that do primarily tax related work. And that's where most of the opportunities are. The next thing is accounting firms are very easy for most LLMs and tax attorneys to get into. So I recommend, and they're easier than law firms doing that. So that's the problem with tax law. Is it can be very difficult for attorneys many times to get into large law firms, even if they have an LLM and good experience. It depends on what kind of experience you have. I mean, you have international tax, you have all sorts of different types of tax. And depending on your experience, you may want to try to do something look like you're very specialized in something. Person wrote, I'm not sure, talked about how do you view the Texas market as some big companies are moving and setting up offices there. Yeah, Texas is an awesome market now. Austin's very good. The whole Texas is very good. Austin has become an exceptional market there, and it's going to be a big market, I think, in the future, a major market. The Texas market is great. That there's lower taxes there. There's actually no state taxes, and Texas is a very good market, and it's growing. Housing is relatively inexpensive. There's a lot of big firms there. There's a lot of smaller firms, but the Texas market is on fire, and it's a great market to be in. And I would, if you're interested, and I would definitely recommend potentially looking at firms there. Is there any region in particular the market's particularly good for someone who does not have immediate contacts? Yeah, so Texas is good. Any market where there's not a lot of people like you. So that would mean any market where there's not a lot of attorneys with your specific type of background that do the kind of work you do would be good. Any market where there's just not a lot of attorneys trying to work there is also good. So that's a lot. I think that's a lot of information. But when I'm talking to attorneys about relocating, I typically will tell them about markets where not a lot of people are trying to relocate. And so it depends on your practice area. But frankly, there's certain practice areas, which are things like most consumer facing practice areas like immigration, family law. You can relocate to lots and lots of places with those. And then corporate, in most markets, it just depends on the practice area. But Texas right now is a booming market, and a lot of markets are doing very well. And the best markets to move if you don't have contacts are typically the largest cities, which are things like New York and Washington, D.C., because they don't really question people relocating there. But then the type of experience you need is a little bit different. Outside of true lateral hiring for associates for specific positions with prior experience, where do you see the law firm hiring outlook for hiring federal clerks in mid-sized markets in the coming markets? I've spoken with many firms that express interest, but they're unsure about business conditions created by the pandemic. I think the hiring outlook is pretty good for people. I think if a law firm's telling you they're unsure about business conditions, that just means that they're unsure about hiring you at the moment. They may say they're unsure about business conditions and they don't have the work, but most law firms, if they see someone that they really like, will express interest in them, even if they don't have necessarily an opening. I do think that especially for federal clerks in mid-sized markets, I don't think you'll have too much of a problem finding something. I would recommend the first market I would always recommend looking at is the one you're currently clerking in. And then after that, other markets. It's not as easy to get a job as a clerk as it once was. So I am sympathetic and because there are a lot of litigators out there, but I do think that the hiring outlook is very good. The only caveat I would add is that because the economy has been doing well and it just seems to be getting better and better, that's for some reason, that's just never been the greatest thing for litigation, because litigation tends to slow down when the economy is really good, because people are just more enthusiastic about the future. People are paying their bills, so there's less commercial litigation. They're less likely to get involved in lawsuits and so forth. That's something I've noticed. Okay, let's see here. Great questions. I'm at 3L at Drexel University in Philadelphia, concentrating in health law, moving to San Francisco Bay Area after graduation in May 2021. I will be taking the July 21-20 bar exam. When is the best time to do it? Time to start applications? Too early to apply now. Okay, you can start applying to things right now. The San Francisco Bay Area is unless you have contacts in San Francisco, it can be a very difficult market to break into because there's so many attorneys there. If you have a health law background, I think that's a good market to work in. I think that health law is a great practice area, and it's a very niche practice area. And especially if you've done anything to do with healthcare law before, I would be careful about making sure that San Francisco is the only place you want to work. I think you can definitely get a job there, but it is very expensive and it's a very large and sophisticated legal market. You want to make sure that you're prepared to compete with a lot of other attorneys there. I see people coming out of schools all the time with LLM degrees, and this is usually not an LLM, but with health law and education and other types of specialties, and they actually do very well. They get jobs because there's not a lot of people with their experience. I would love it also if you got an LLM in health law. I think that would be very helpful for you. But I don't think it's wrong to start the applications now. But law firms are always nervous about hiring people in California without the bar, unless they've been summer associates there and that sort of thing, because it's a tough exam. And anybody can pass it. You just need to study a lot. And that's the big caveat with that exam, is just you need to really make sure you do nothing but from the second you get out of school and your classes start, just make studying for that like a 12-hour day job, and then you'll pass. But most people don't do that. And that's why the majority of people, or a good percentage, don't pass it, because they don't study a lot. But I would start applications probably after taking the bar, right after taking the bar. But you could certainly start them now, and then you could send out a bunch of applications now and then do it again after the bar, and even apply to the same places that may not respond right now, and they won't reject you. They won't remember getting your application. Let's see here. Partners at small law firms trying to secure a summer clerk or intern position, but have not been having much luck. What is the best way to improve my outreach? What can I say to entice partners to respond and be interested in bringing me on? Say I'm from New York City. Should I focus on New York City firms and emphasize me being from a New York City? So what I would recommend is find people in the markets you're interested in that went to your law school or have something in common with you, and then email them and ask them if they could get an informational interview and if they know any place where you might be able to apply. And that typically would be how I would take care of that. If you ask them for a job, for an internship, that's going to put them off. So do what's called an informational interview. An informational interview is just saying, I'm also a student that went to George Washington University. I'm from New York, and I'd love to talk to you about your impressions of the legal market and so forth, and then talk to them that way. And that can definitely get you in the door. That's how I would do it. I think the emails are a good idea. I also think any type of networking you can do as well. But New York City is a very difficult market trying to get into. If you're doing small firms there, that's fine. I think you would probably be able to get something. I always recommend also sending letters in the mail. So if you could send hard copy letters, and that, because hard copy letters an email has to be opened and then it has to be reviewed. But if you get a letter, it'll sit on someone's desk. I have right now, someone sent me a letter and it's on my desk, and it's going to sit here until I review it. And at the same time, with the emails, I've probably got 100,000 emails in my account that either I could review if I wanted to. It's just, so it's much easier when you send a printed letter. And I recommend everyone on this call to send a letter if you ever can. It's much more effective. Okay, let's see. How's the greater Nashville job market for litigators? I think it's good. If you're from Nashville, I think it's very good. If you're from Tennessee, I think it's very good. But the Nashville market is also good if you're from out of state. I don't think it's a bad market. I think it's a good market. That would be a good market. That would be a good market for someone to choose to work in. I think I love Nashville. And it's a market that where a lot of local people are. The only issue with that is, I mean, you've got Vanderbilt and some other things that are feeders there, but Nashville's a great. Have any advice for someone that works in the New York District Attorney who wants to relocate to Florida before the 3-year commitment ends? I mean, I don't know as a district attorney. If you want to relocate to Florida, my advice would be, I don't know what the commitment means exactly, and if you can't leave during the commitment, but assuming that there's nothing negative that's going to happen and with your career and so forth, if you do that, then, and I don't know what type of job you want, but I would think that, I know the Miami prosecutor's office is a very big office, and other offices that are very similar to where you're at are big offices. The only problem is they're going to check your references probably if you apply now. If you apply to law firms, they won't check your references, but if you apply to other government jobs, they will. But if you want to work in another law firm, then I don't think there's anything wrong with keeping your eyes on job boards and applying to them as they become available. That's what I would do. And then if you want to make an all-out move, then just applying, you will definitely be able to get a job in another district attorney's office in Florida if you do. But my only concern would be having your references checked and someone calling your office and them finding out that you're applying during a commitment. But if you talk to a firm and say that I'm applying to a few places in Florida, maybe talk to the district attorney's office and tell them what you're doing. If they say it's okay, then I don't see anything wrong with that. So I had to retire from a prior job under unsavory circumstances, not criminal but close. I never lost my license, but was never formally sanctioned, but the issue was locally publicized. What are my chances of finding work if I am willing to move? The first thing is there are ways to fix the search results that are coming up if there's negative results coming up about you and so forth on the internet. So that's something that I would recommend looking into. And so they push that stuff off the first page. I don't know what you did, but if you were never sanctioned by the bar, it can't be that bad. And if you may be able to find work locally as well, someone's going to take a chance on you in terms of businesses. I know people that have done, horrible things, and have still been able to find other positions. I don't think that's really something that you should be that worried about, but I would try to clean up my reputation. Then I would have a story ready to go if the law firm tries to say, if your previous employer tries to say anything negative about you. Another option might be just, you don't necessarily need to work in another law firm. You can certainly do other types of work as well. Or you can even set up your own practice and all sorts of things. But if you do relocate, there's other ways you can handle it. It's funny, I was talking to someone, this is a crazy thing, but I was talking to someone that is an attorney now, and that person used to be a professional model, and they actually changed their name legally because they didn't want to come up that they'd been a model before, so clients would take them more seriously. And which I thought was interesting. So sometimes you could even, if you're worried about people finding out about what you did previously, maybe you could even change your name. Not recommending it, but I thought that was very interesting. That model had done that, and it wasn't because she'd done anything wrong. It was just because she didn't want her past to follow her, and she did it the second she graduated from law school. Could you please comment on the prospects for relocation or lateral move for someone with extensive experience as an appellate attorney, specifically prosecuting criminal appeals? Sure, I think you can definitely do that in any city in the country. That sounds like a great specialty with pretty much anywhere. So I don't really see a problem with that. Now, this isn't the kind of thing that recruiters are typically involved in, but I don't see why that service wouldn't be in demand everywhere. I think that's a great specialty to have. And yeah, I think that's something that would be very good. I would talk to criminal attorneys all over the country. In every city, there's lots of criminal attorneys. You could even set up your own practice doing that or get hired out to do that. So I think that's a great specialty to have. And I think you could definitely find a lot of places. Here, you mentioned that you have placed people internationally in Wisconsin. What practice areas? The promise practice areas are corporate, capital markets, which is basically stocks and bonds, corporate capital markets. And then the next one is project finance. The next one is sometimes, not as common, international arbitration. Most people that speak Japanese, if you speak Japanese in our corporate, it's pretty easy to get placed, right, in Japan. then you have finance, patent prosecution, sometimes even trademark. This is more common. This is typically Asia and the UK, Middle East, and I don't know why Middle East. My experience in terms of people getting placed, and I'm sure there's some practice areas and things that I'm missing, but this is the majority of it. And there's also general corporate is less common, but you can certainly get people jobs. For a job through a headhunter, I thought I was in a strong position, but then found out the legal malpractice claim that I defeated was this qualifying factor. How much of a problem can this be even going? It's just most attorneys, or a lot of attorneys in different points in their career, will be sued for legal malpractice. So just because someone filed a legal malpractice claim and is not something really to worry about, the fact that it happened is a reason for them to disqualify you, and that's fine. Every time someone is interested in hiring you, they're asking themselves and the firm's asking whether or not they can find someone more qualified that may not have the same issues. I wouldn't really worry too much about having been sued for malpractice in the past. I think that it's probably not going to come up and in the future, it may, but I don't think it's really that much of a problem. I think that it's just the particular firm. Most firms should be able to look beyond that and understand standard if it even comes up. And I don't know how it came up, if it was on a questionnaire and so forth, and they probably looked into what was surrounding it and made their decision based on that. But I really don't recommend worrying too much about that, and just plow forward and just have a really good story for what happened when they ask you. The best way to head off this stuff too is to make people really like you first, and then after they really like you, then when this stuff comes up, you're in a much better place to explain it. That's how people deal with negative information and relationships and all sorts of things, is they allow it to come up later. They don't allow it. It's not the first thing they bring up. So sometimes I don't know how they found it, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Okay. See here. Are looking to leave New York, Sheffield. I would put my parents' Florida address. That would be what I would do if you want to work in that city. It's much easier for them to hire someone locally than it is to hire someone that might move there if they get the job. It's less risk for them to hire someone locally than it is someone that's going to have to travel there for an interview and so forth. So yeah, if you can, I would put my parents' Florida address. And when they ask you in interviews, saying your family's from Florida and stuff will definitely help you. Okay, the next question is, after you've completed the interview, what is the most effective written or oral follow-up that you've seen a prospective employer? So what we do for our candidates at BCG is we typically write down the people that they've spoken. We send a follow-up. And what I like to do is, if you spoke to 3 people, you write, you send it to the recruiting coordinator, or someone along those lines, and say something that each of the 3 people said, one thing that each of the 3 people said that you liked about the firm. So thing each person said. So that would be something along the lines of, I spoke to Bob Smith, and Bob talked about how you guys are the leaders in doing trust and estates litigation in the market. And I love trust and estates litigation and want to be associated with leader. I also spoke with Nancy Smith, and Nancy Smith indicated that the firm really does feel like a family. We take a retreat once a year, and we always get together for lunch and have a community lunch on Friday. And it'd be important for me to be part of a firm where I feel where I can associate with other attorneys and get to know them outside of work. That would be something along those lines. And so you put together those 3 different things that match what you talked about with people, and then you send that, and that makes a huge difference. Law firms are very risk averse of getting rejected. So they don't want to be like rejected from offers and so forth. And that's an issue for them. So next question. In your oversupply header, you list an oversupply of attorneys with 6 or 7 years of experience in no business. If one works in personal injury litigation, what is a foreseeable path to a book of business on this field? So you're right. So most personal injury attorneys do not have books of business unless they have their own firms and they're advertising. The oversupply of 6 and 7 years of experience, the reason I made that example was if you take attorneys with 1 to 5 years of experience and attorneys with 5 to, let's say, 50, because I mean, attorneys practice forever, 50 years of experience, that's 45 to 5. So there's 7 times as many attorneys, or more than that, because there's a lot more, 7 times as many senior attorneys as junior attorneys. So that's all. So there's an oversupply of them, and more senior attorneys are just more difficult to manage. They're an unproven commodity and so forth. Getting a book of business in personal injury litigation just means that You develop a reputation for your work and you get a lot of referrals, or you potentially can get work in another way. And there's all sorts of ways to get work, or you can go to a firm and develop a certain type of expertise where you're being given a lot of work. Following COVID-19 and the increase in work from home, do you believe attorneys will try to relocate without changing firms? How do you anticipate firms responding to relocation requests? So law firms are typically, especially branch offices, are run in different ways. And if you're working in one office, typically you're working in that one office because they have a need. And then the other branch office may not have a need. So that's something that I would be concerned about. And different branch offices are run in different ways. So some branch offices are run by the main office, and others are independent little entities there that make their own hiring decisions. So it depends on the firm you're working with, how they're going to respond to it. And that's just something that I would recommend that you need to think about in terms of how you approach that. I don't know your firm specifically and how they would react to that, but most firms are open to it if they have a need in their other office. But just remember that many other offices are going to be independent in terms of how they hire. So just because it's the same firm doesn't really mean it's the same firm. If that makes sense. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions for today. And I look forward to talking to everyone next week. I also do a presentation for law firms every Thursday at the same time. And you're also free to come to that and ask questions. The presentation is typically much shorter, so you get out a little bit earlier. But I appreciate everyone showing up today. Thank you.